Chapter 26, The New Deal, 1933 to 1941. So there are a lot of slides in this PowerPoint because we're going to hit and run on a lot of topics. But they all have to do with the New Deal and the programs that were put in place by FDR to try to curb the effects of the Great Depression. So we'll be looking at that and then how the New Deal affected blacks and Native Americans. And then we'll end with the beginnings of World War II. The 100 Days. So by the date of Roosevelt's inauguration, the banking system had disintegrated, and conservatives and radicals alike were convinced that the government had to intervene to try to stop the Great Depression or to stop the effects of it. Hoover had been really hesitant to do anything like that because the government had never flexed its muscles quite that large before. But there were people lining up outside of even the most stable banks trying to withdraw their life savings. This is called a run on the bank, when everybody pulls their money out at one time. And so during the first 100 days of President Roosevelt's presidency, Congress passed an impressive body of legislation. On March 5th, 1933, FDR declared a bank holiday, and this was an attempt to stop people from pulling all of their money out of the banks at the same time. During this time, also the FDIC was created. This is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You see this in most banks. You'll see FDIC insured or FDIC on little plaques everywhere. But basically, this insures your money. If the bank goes under, then the government will give you your money back. Theoretically, they could just print all that money, but it insures up to $100,000 on your bank account if the bank goes under. It also extended the power of the Federal Reserve Board, established the Home Owners Loan Corporation, and regulated the Securities Exchange. So again, this is broad, far-reaching legislation. Roosevelt really didn't have like a comprehensive plan of action, and he was elected with no clear plan, just this idea of a New Deal. He was going to try to do everything he could to solve the problem of the Great Depression, but there really wasn't a clear-cut way to do that. Rather, he just employed an ad hoc approach, just come up with one thing after the other, and sometimes this resulted in contradictory policies. He also took the nation off the gold standard. He hoped that that would cause prices to rise. They had fallen because of overproduction. And although most of these measures of the 100 days were designed to stimulate the Economy Act actually reduced the salaries of federal employees and cut veterans' benefits. So the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration, the problems of unemployment and industrial stagnation received probably the highest priority during the 100 days. Congress gave $500 million for aid to the needy, and they created the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, that was put into place to employ tens of thousands of young men. Also, NIRA, N-I-R-A, or the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was really controversial. It created the Public Works Administration, or the PWA, lots of acronyms here. But they were given the authority to spend $3.3 billion, and it allowed manufacturers to establish price and production limits. It established a minimum wage and a maximum set of hours, and it guaranteed laborers the right to bargain collectively. NIRA had actually envisioned, a system of industry-wide organizations of capitalists and workers who would be supervised by the government that would be able to resolve conflicts internally. I'm not sure that it quite worked out like that, but that was the plan. The National Recovery Administration oversaw the drafting and operation of business codes. And even though all of this money was put into this program, even NERA failed to end the Depression. Dominant producers in each of the industries supervised the drafting and operation of the codes, and they used their power to raise prices and limit production rather than to hire more workers and increase output. This did do away with the problem of child labor, though, so that was good. Even though the NIRA provided protection for collective bargaining, the conservative and craft-oriented AFL, or American Federation of Labor, really wasn't too happy about enrolling unskilled workers on an industry-wide basis. Some of the labor leaders who didn't like AFL created another organization called the Congress of Industrial Organizations that was formed to help workers or organize workers on an industry-wide basis without regard to what type of craft they had. And basically, the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, ended up being one giant union. So the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 combined production limits with government subsidization of farm commodities. And FDR was finally beginning to think that maybe the government was too, maybe even overcommitted to industry. And so, in effect, the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, paid farmers to produce less. Again, one of the major causes of the Great Depression was overproduction. We had all of this fancy farm machinery that produced a whole lot of stuff really quickly, and there weren't enough buyers for it, so it drove the prices down. They couldn't pay back their loans. So some farmers did benefit from this. Some people, like sharecroppers and tenant farmers, didn't really benefit from the AAA at all. So during this time, there was an extended drought that made life even more difficult for farmers in sections of the Midwest. And there are parts of the Midwest where the lands are not very good for farming, but because of the techniques of dry farming and mechanization, farmers were able to grow crops there. This drought, though, devastated crops, and the winds blew away topsoil. And so basically, these strong winds would come in, they would scoop up dried out dirt and blow it in large clouds throughout the plains. And in some instances, it caused dust pneumonia. It went into people's lungs, and for some people, it was even fatal. Tens of thousands of people abandoned their farms during this time. I encourage you to Google images of the Dust Bowl. It is quite phenomenal after the video's over. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, all of these have abbreviations. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act of 1933 created a board that was authorized to construct dams, power plants, and transmission lines. They were also allowed to market electrical power to individuals and communities. And the good thing is that it really provided like a measuring stick for evaluating the rates and efficiency of private power companies. And in addition to that, they engaged in flood control, soil conservation, and even reforestation projects. And I think at this point, Teddy Roosevelt, I think the ninth cousin maybe of FDR, probably would have been really proud of this little aspect of the New Deal. The TVA never really became the comprehensive regional planning organization that some people had hoped that it would be, but it did improve the standard of living for many people in the Tennessee Valley. So the New Deal spirit. Even though Roosevelt came to office without a clear-cut plan for dealing with the Depression, his administration was infused with a much-needed wave of optimism. And Roosevelt was receptive to new ideas. And so the increased New Deal bureaucracies drew academics and professionals into government service. And again, it was never really a clearly stated ideological movement. I mean, it drew heavily on populism and Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism, and even Woodrow Wilson, the Wilsonian tradition. Washington became like a battleground for special interests because it wasn't clearly defined. One guy, William Leuchtenberg, even described the New Deal as interest group democracy. For the first time in a long time, it gave interest groups other than big businesses a voice in Washington. On the other hand, it didn't really help out the unorganized majority. So in 1934, at least 9 million Americans were still unemployed, and hundreds of thousands of them were in desperate need, like on the verge of starvation. And despite that, Democrats continued to increase their majorities in Congress. And part of that was Roosevelt's unemployment policies. Roosevelt had appointed a guy named Harry Hopkins to head the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, in 1933. And this program gave $500 million to states to be dispensed through state relief programs. And he insisted that unemployed people needed jobs, not handouts. And then in November of 1933, Hopkins persuaded Roosevelt to create the Civil Works Administration, or the CWA, and this employed millions of people on public works projects like building or repairing bridges, putting murals on buildings, pretty much anything that people could be paid for. And Roosevelt was actually a little bit frightened by the cost of the CWA. He soon abolished it because Hopkins spent $1 billion in less than 5 months. Nevertheless, in 1935, Roosevelt put Hopkins in charge of the new WPA, or Works Progress Administration. Even though this would be banned 8 years later, it did find employment for 8.5 million people. In spite of all these efforts to employ the unemployed, at no time during the Depression did unemployment fall below 10% of the workforce. Roosevelt's fear of deficit spending or going into debt meant that many of the New Deal measures didn't provide enough stimulus to the economy. So some of the literature during the Depression. There was a writer named John Dos Passos, that's an S, who published harshly anti-capitalist and super pessimistic trilogy USA between 1930 and 1936. John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath. This probably best portrayed the plight of farmers who were forced to abandon their drought-plagued land and pretty much become migrant workers in California. And then probably the best American novelist of the era was William Faulkner. And he wrote about the South. And between 1929 and 1932, he published The Sound and the Fury, Light in August, As I Lay Dying, and Sanctuary. So 4 publications in a period of like 3 years. But in each of these, the characters were imprisoned in their settings no matter how hard they tried to escape. And that was pretty much the underlying current of the Great Depression. So 3 extremists. Roosevelt's moderation provoked extremists on both the left and the right. Probably the most popular was the, quote, kingfish Huey Long. And he was a senator from Louisiana, and he never challenged white supremacy in Louisiana, but he did have concern for the plight of all poor people. And so after he had initially supported Roosevelt, he split from the administration and introduced his Share Our Wealth plan. And this was a program to redistribute the nation's wealth. This movement had about 4 million members. And then there was a guy named Father Charles Coughlin, the, quote, radio priest. And he was less powerful than Long, but he probably became more widely influential. And he called for currency inflation, and he attacked the alleged sympathy for communists and Jews within Roosevelt's administration. And really, his program resembled fascism more than anything else. Nevertheless, he received contributions of about $500,000 per year. And then there was Dr. Francis Townshend. That's an S. And he proposed old age revolving pensions. And basically, this would give $200 per month to the nation's elderly people on the condition that they would not hold a job and that they would spend the money within 30 days. And the purpose of that was to stimulate the economy and not to take jobs that unemployed people would have. But the collective threat of these radical reformers forced FDR to adopt a bolder approach towards solving the problems of the Great Depression. So we'll stop there and we'll pick up in the next video with the Second New Deal.